Well, this is the follow-up on last week's video. It's a bit more interesting than last week's video, I think. And I got some follow-up stuff on it that you'll probably enjoy. Let me see if I can fix my camera here a little bit. There you go, that's better. I'm better centered in the frame. Cherokee round 2, very strange misfires. Now, it returned literally 3 years later. Tens of thousands of miles had gone by. And the new concern was that it was misfiring sometimes, but it was an intermittent problem. And I put one of my guys in it to drive it, and he drove it for an hour, and it never misfired a single time on him. And but the soldier that brought it to us says, this thing's still misfiring and all that. He actually developed the misfire. Now, it had run just fine on the 30-minute drive to the college when the guy brought it over there. And he wasn't sure that we would be able to duplicate it when he got there. Took a quick look under the hood. There's no reason not to, just to see what you see. You'll see people beside the road looking under the hood of their cars, and you're not even sure they know what they're looking at, just to see if there's anything they can see, something busted or whatever. Well, this engine has this funky coil rail. And in the way that we typically think, we might think that this one fires these two, this one fires these two, and this one fires these two. But remember, these firing companions, right? And so the companions would be 1 and 6. They'd be these two, and then they'd be these two. See, so these are companions. Because if you looked at the way, if you had the head off and you spin one of these inline 6 engines over, the 1 and 6 will be going up and down at the same time. One's on compression when the other's on exhaust. The same way you're going to go with 2 and 5, and then 3 and 4. They're companions. So one coil. So you're saying, so this coil, if it's firing this one, then it's also firing that one. They're not firing this one out. But here's the other thing: we put an engine in a Jeep Wrangler one time that had a 4-liter in it. Ordered the engine. It came in. It was a used engine. I think it was 1 year model removed or something like that. And the guy put the engine in there and plugged everything in just like it was supposed to be plugged in. The wires plug in back here at the back. That thing was popping and snorting and kicking back like it had crossed plug wires. How is that even possible when it's got a coil rail? And so just on a whim, I don't even know if that guy remembers this. He works at a parts house over here close to us now. He didn't finish my program, but he was pretty sharp. He's also a race car driver of sorts, young fella. A big beard on his face anyway, but he's real quiet, doesn't have a lot to talk about, but he's sharp. And he took the coil rail off the original locked up engine that had come out of the Wrangler and put that in place of the coil rail that came on the replacement engine from LKQ, and it's fired up and ran just fine. And so the point is, just because these coil rails look the same don't mean they are the same. I had also seen that a time or two on these Fords. If you've got a Ford coil pack where the wires plug in from the top instead of the side, they're going to be wired different on the inside, you see. And so that's really important. One thing pay attention to on these 4-liters is if this shaft locks up, it will actually grab this housing and spin it. You can see that signature mark right there. So if you got one that's a no start and it comes in, and you got a one of these 4-liters which got this cam synchronizer, this shaft likes to gall. Now this also does this on some of your Tauruses, but a Ford will typically run when the cam sensor's dead or when it's not spinning. But this is an important piece. That on the Ford you'll get squeaking noises out of it. It sounds like a belt squeaking. On this one here, when it locked up, it spun that thing. It tried to spin it, and it spun it that far, and you could see the mark that was left by the hold down. When you glance down there and see that, that's the reason for that no start. That's an important distinction there. So this is what the cam synchronizer looks like. Driven by the camshaft. It also drives the oil pump. That's a fairly common thing. Alright, on our test drive. We took the test drive on this thing. And at first it started bucking like it had a spark plug leak past the plug boot. But the farther we went, the worse it ran. And the guy said, all you have to do to correct this is switch the Jeep off and restart it. Well, that's an interesting clue right there, you see. Alright, so it had dropped 4 cylinders. Believe it or not, it was skipping worse and worse as we went. This thing was running on 2 cylinders. I didn't even think that was possible. But driving down the road, you know, I started disconnecting injectors to determine which cylinders were silent. You know, because it had killed the injectors, the only 2. Now you got to remember, if it detects a misfire, it'll turn the injectors off. So it doesn't mean the injectors are the cause of this. It just means they're a symptom of it. So you know, if you've got a cylinder that's misfiring for some other reason on these newer platforms to protect the catalytic converter, which is really important to the manufacturer since it's guaranteed for 80,000 miles, they're going to do whatever they have to do to try to save that converter. So if it's misfiring on a particular cylinder for whatever reason, it's going to shut that injector down so no fuel is going in there. Now, if the injector's leaking, that's, you know, something it can't do anything about. Well, this is the codes we got. A coil primary circuit fault, PO353, and a cam crank signal loss. Now that was odd too. But when it was restarted, the problem disappeared. Another test drive, we didn't get it to act up. Scan tool got these out of it and say, okay, so we got coil primary stuff going on here. This is interesting. What's that? What's the deal on this thing? You know, so we were thinking about this. Now I was thinking the coil rail assembly was going to go in sour, based on the fact that the dead cylinders were always in pairs and they were always on companions. And think about that for a minute. That was an interesting set of circumstances, wasn't it? So we replaced the coil rail because of the companion cylinder dropping out. That was $100. Put that in there, no joy. Didn't change a doggone thing. The thing still started skipping the same way. So I said, well, we, you know, had to deal with that problem. And I told the guy, said, we put a coil rail on it, that didn't fix it. And he said, I just leave it on there, probably needs it anyway. So I started the scan tool and looked at cam and crank counters on the little Nemesis screen to get a feel for what I was looking at. You know, you can look at this and you're really not sure. This side of the screen is running slow. Running faster than this side. That's why it looks different. It's scrolling across here, and what it does is it gives you this slower, and then it compresses it so you can get a bigger picture over it. It's pretty cool how that thing does. That's why the screen changes right there in the middle. It had a misfire count of 255. That was the maximum number of misfires it could store. If you know anything about binary codes, you'll know why 255 is the magic number. And so I'm saying, well, I'm really not getting anywhere. We're looking for data that's going to give us an idea of what's wrong with this thing, you know. So it started misfiring about the time I got back to the shop when I took it to lunch, and we wound up with these misfire counts that locked out at 255. Now, not all of them will stop at 255. The newer ones, and a lot of Chevys and stuff, they'll just go up to as many misfires as they can count and never stop counting. This particular one would only count to 255, and it felt like that's all the information you needed anyway. And so, but we had a little bit of misfire going on cylinder 6 and cylinder 1, but not near what we had on these 2 cylinders right here. Companion cylinders again. So, what I did was a bad vehicle can ruin a good PCM, but a bad PCM won't damage a good vehicle. See what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is, if you suspect your engine controller is bad, then you need to take that engine controller and put it on a vehicle that runs just fine, because that PCM is not going to damage a good vehicle. However, if you take the good PCM and put it on a bad vehicle and something has damaged the PCM on the bad vehicle, you may have 2 damaged PCMs. It's just really smart to take that thing. But I put that thing on my yellow Jeep, which was a 2001 model, and the controller was the same, and I just plugged it in and let it hang there, you know, and I drove it all weekend long. Never had any problem at all with mine misfiring like that. So I said, this is not a PCM problem. It's just real easy to throw that box at it and hope that's it. I don't know how many times I've seen that. Heck, I've done it a time or two myself, you know, and I don't have all the answers. I'll be the first one to tell you that. Anybody that claims they have all the answers is not as smart as they think they are. I went to school under one instructor one time. I sat in one of his classes at KC Vision, and the way he came across basically was, I can figure out anything in 10 minutes, and if you can't figure out anything in 10 minutes, you're an idiot. I mean, that's the way he came across, and I don't think a lot of people appreciated that. But anyway, so the Jeep had deteriorated to the point the problem was almost always there. I mean, and this is a good thing, because it was even with the engine cold, it would idle just fine, but as soon as the throttle was open, it would drop injector pulse, first one pair of cylinders, then another, and then it would stall. it would eventually drop them all. So that was an interesting thing. I put a different coil primary connector on using an overlay. I actually cobbled this together temporarily, and it got the coil rail out of the picture. And I used a Ford coil, and the students were totally astonished that I was able to pull this off, but it ain't that complicated. Same number of wires, if you know which ones are the companions and how to wire it. I just use the plug wires from a trainer vehicle, trainer engine, and plugged that in. It cranked up and ran normally, but it had all the same symptoms, you see. And I started noticing on the scope, I was getting these screwball multiple firing patterns. What the heck is this? I say, is this something that's supposed to happen? Because a lot of the times, you'll have a multi-strike system. This is not a multi-strike system. And what I was getting right here was, all this did was muddy the water. Made me think, what the heck am I dealing with here? You ever get your head, I worked on this thing for almost a week, off and on. Sometimes when there were no students in there, I'd be working on it when they weren't there and getting readings and all that kind of stuff. But I was going to fix this thing or know the reason why. So I used the Intero PDA to check the current ramp pattern on the coils, and I found each coil was intermittently given 2 current ramps. Bam, it was double firing the coils and all. That was causing a misfire. That was shutting the injectors down. I mean, there was just all kinds of wild, crazy stuff going on here. And this was driving me nuts, trying to figure it out. I love this PDA, but there were some issues I had with it a time or two, but I'll talk about that another time. It eventually died, and you couldn't replace it and all. But there's your cam and there's your crank. This guy right here, Glenn Young, I don't know if you know about him. He lives in Houston, and I bought equipment from him. And I also went and taught some electronic diesel classes for him down in Houston at the trade show back in 2003. But he was letting me know he was shipping. I was buying a smoke machine from him, and he called me to tell me he was shipping that piece of equipment to me. And I says, Glenn, let me run something past you. Glenn's sharp as a tack, and he still is. And he said, well, when I reach the end of my thought process on something like that, I usually look to see if the cam and the crank sensor are synchronized properly. And I said, well, I don't see that anywhere. Now, I could have checked mine and compared it, which is probably what I should have done, but this was something that never entered my thinking until Glenn mentioned this to me. And so I hooked up the scope. There's your cam, there's your crank. This is the pattern we got. Notice how this is lined up with one of those. This is they got little 4 windows in the crank that goes wheeling past. That thing was lined up over here. I mean, and it was right there on, just right on that. Okay, so he described the pattern the way it should look. He said it ought to be split in the middle between 2 of them 4 towers. So we adjusted it. You just turn it like you would a distributor and watch this thing move. And it got it over in the middle, and that took care of it. That's what it ought to look like, right? Okay. All right. So you can find top dead center compression to adjust the synchronizer by put it dead on 0, just like you see here, and there's a hole in the sink housing, and there's another hole in the cup. When you line this up on 0, you put that in there so that this is lined up, and you stick a toothpick, or I put a piece of stiff wire through there. All this trouble, and I could have fixed this with a toothpick. Worked on it a solid week. Well, why did the trouble codes lead us astray? They're supposed to help you, not hurt you. The problem had nothing to do with any coil primary fault. The companion cylinders were dropping out together. This thing was so complicated in its algorithms, it didn't know even what to tell me about which direction I should go, you see, and it was leading me in the wrong direction, which was a bear. Well, you might know Mac Vandenbrink. He read this Scan Tools, Oscopes, and Toothpicks article I wrote for Motor Age about this problem, and he sent me one of his training course DVDs in an envelope, and he also included a toothpick. Now, this guy is super, super sharp, or he was. He passed away in 2020, but he had in that presentation that he sent me, one of the things that he showed was how you can look at a ignition scope pattern, and you can determine if the camshaft lobe is rounded off by looking at ignition scope pattern. He was really sharp, top of the line. I did not even know this guy was reading my articles, and I was very flattered. This guy, as a joke, he sent me a toothpick, in a little little cellophane wrapped toothpick in there with that scope. I thought that was fun. And a little note that he wrote me. It was just something I got that note somewhere. Well, I was in class at KC Vision where Jerry Truglia was talking about a Grand Cherokee, and during the break, I said, "Hey, I wrote an article about that." And he goes, "I know, I read your article." Well, see, same deal. I didn't even know this guy knew who I was, but apparently he would read my articles too. And Jerry's still a friend of mine. I don't hardly ever have any contact with him anymore, but he's still going around teaching with Pete Meyer and stuff like that. Anyway, I hope you got something out of this. We've been here about 15 minutes. It didn't take us long to whip through this. Let me know if you learned something or got something out of this, and I'll talk to you another time. Thanks for tuning in.